Hey Central. Hey, thanks for tuning in this morning. I'll be looking at some passages in Isaiah with you about the suffering servant. And I want to just jump into it because I've got a lot that I'd like to cover with us today. I'm going to read for you a passage, first of all, from Isaiah chapter 49, starting in verse 15. Can a woman forget her nursing child, or lack compassion for the son of her womb? Even if she could forget, I, the Lord, will not forget you. Behold, I have inscribed you on the palms of my hands. Your walls are ever before me. In the first year of our daughter's life, my wife and I very rarely got away from her. And I mean that as a positive thing, but those few occasions where we stepped away and went on a date, even if it was just to get groceries or to go and clean and do the dishes, those very few times, as we would be driving away, inevitably, my wife would look at me as we're leaving and say that she already misses our daughter. That's the kind of memory and it's the kind of longing for that a mom has for her child. There's a certain bond that takes place there, which is why the passage I just quoted for you, at least the first half of that, talking about, even if a mother forgets her child, the Lord will not forget us. And then there's this passage, see, I have inscribed you on the palms of my hands. Of course, we know that Jesus kept the scars, kept the holes in his hands. In John 20, when Thomas is confronted with Jesus after the resurrection, Thomas is told to feel the hole in his side and feel the holes in his hands. Jesus, after his resurrection, kept those holes. These hands of Jesus that formed the world, that forms life in the mother's womb, that threw the stars into existence, that holds the scepter of his eternal kingdom, the hands that control the waves of the ocean and make everything move in accordance with his will. Those were the hands that have a hole in them, scribed with our names, with a memory that is eternally placed with God. See, what we see on the cross is this demonstrated love that Romans 5 speaks about. That when you look at what's taking place on the cross, you see, part of what's taking place there, you see how memorable you are to God, how important you are to God. He suffered on our behalf. And so he took on our infirmities. One more passage from Isaiah that I'd like to quote. Isaiah 53, 4 through 5. This passage, I'm sure, will, for if you've been in the church for a while, will ring out to you. Surely he bore our infirmities, carried our diseases, yet we were counted him stricken, struck down by God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. And upon him was the punishment that made us whole. And by his bruises we are healed. What I want to suggest to you this morning, just in a sentence, and what I really hope to communicate clearly in this short video together with you, is that just as Christ took on our sufferings, we are invited to take on his sufferings. Let me explain what I mean. We read in Hebrews chapter 2, Hebrews chapter 4, that Christ had to be made human, fully human in every way, had to be made like his brothers, as Hebrews 2 says it. So he took on our infirmities, took on our pain, took on the disaster that is sin. And to such an extent that whenever you look at what is happening on the cross, you see just how dark and painful sin really is. But it's not as if Christ died so that we don't have to put something to death. It's not as if Christ died so that we don't have to die. In fact, the scriptures are quite clear that just as Christ took on our sufferings and infirmities, we are invited to take on his sufferings, a redeemed form of suffering, to be crucified with Christ. Listen to how the scriptures describe this. There's several that I'd like to share, but I'm just going to share a few of these with you. Notice what it calls us to do. Galatians 2:20. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Mark chapter 8:34. Then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. Matthew chapter 10, verse 38. Whoever does not take up their cross is not worthy of me. In other words, church, what Christ is calling us to do is just as he took on our sufferings, we are called to suffer along with him, to take up our cross. In fact, you can't be a Christian unless you are willing to take up your cross and follow him, to put to death. As Colossians 3 and Ephesians 4 says, what we are called to do as Christians is to put to death whatever remains, to crucify the old self with its passions and desires, and put on the new self. For just as Christ was crucified and we become united with him in that, Romans 6 tells us, if we have been united with him in his death, we will be united with him in his resurrection. And so Christ resurrects in us what we are willing to put to death, our old way of life. And so the church is called to put to death and to be crucified with Christ. And what I want to just offer as an idea for you to kind of practice this out. It's a practice I do. I actually don't do this very often in front of people, just because I think it can be distracting and people might think I'm doing it for the wrong reasons. But living out these passages, I have been crucified with Christ. I'm called to take up my cross. I'm called to be united with him in his death. I'm called to put to death, to crucify my sin, just to say it plainly. What I do is I've been doing this for several years now. When I'm trying to live this out, I just very simply make the sign of the cross. And I don't know if you can see it, but I'm making the sign of the cross on my body, starting with the head and my stomach and my right side and my left side. And it's not because I'm Catholic, it's not because I'm Orthodox, it's simply because I believe that I'm crucified with Christ and I'm trying to live this out. And there's nothing magical about that. But I'm training myself to think of myself as someone who is taking up their cross, someone who is being crucified with Christ so that I can resurrect in a new life, so that I can put to death my sin and crucify it and live this new life. Because what God offers us, since he took on our sufferings and redeemed it, we are allowed to participate in his sufferings, therefore become like him. For he became like us so that we can become like him. And becoming like us, he suffered, so that through suffering like him, we can become like him. And that's a mouthful, I know, but it's truly beautiful what the Lord has done. So church, live out the crucified life. Put to death the old way of living. Be crucified with Christ. And let Christ, as this new creation, live in you. Have a blessed day.